while we waited. We are trying the class a little bit earlier than usual, so we'll see how it works out. Hey, Mayor, great to see you. I was just saying how we miss you today. I was just talking to Shoshana about that. But great to see you. Great to see everyone who's here, and maybe people will join us as they come. Maybe they won't. I was just saying, we usually do this a little bit later, but today we're going to be having a Yurtzeit Mincha Mariv right after this. So we're going to be doing this in our class a little bit earlier than usual. So thank you guys who were able to make it. And for those who aren't, we'll send out the video recording. But for those who are here and were listening, we were just listening to a couple different versions of the classic Tu B'Shvat song, Hashkedia Parachat, the almond trees are blossoming. And first of all, when I think of Tu B'Shvat, that's just always the first thing I think of, because that was like ingrained in me as like a child. Like Tu B'Shvat is Hashkedia Parachat. So I was just playing some versions of that before. But really, Hashkedia Parachat, that song, is really what inspired what we're going to be baking together today. Because one of the classic Israeli songs for Tu B'Shvat is about the blossoming of the almond tree, Hashkedia Parachat. And part of that is because almond trees are native to Israel. That makes sense, of course. And on Tu B'Shvat, we're celebrating the produce of Israel, celebrating the harvest season. We'll talk a little bit more about exactly what we celebrate on Tu B'Shvat later. But because of that, we celebrate the blossoming of the almond tree. But more specifically, the almond tree is one of the first trees to blossom and one of the fastest trees to blossom. It's the first one in Israel that starts bearing flowers and eventually fruit. And the process is extremely quick and it's done very quickly. So because of that, the almond tree culturally, colloquially in Israel, has become associated with the start of the blossoming season, the start of the spring season, the start of the growth season. It's the first tree to blossom. It blossoms early in Nisan, apparently, which is early on, we know, in the spring. So given that, we can understand culturally why it became such a marker for Israeli culture, for the Israeli songs about Tu B'Shvat. But what's really interesting, and I think I might have mentioned this last year too a little bit, is that in the Torah itself, and in Tanakh, the almond tree also has a pretty significant role. And it seems like of all the trees, well, there's a lot of mention of olive trees, of course, in the Torah and Tanakh. But of all the trees, it really seems like the almond tree is one that's very characteristic or very important for the Jewish people. So just as a very basic start, the rabbis say that the staff that Moshe carried was an almond tree, a stick of an almond tree. And that's not arbitrary. That's learned from later on in the Torah, when Korach challenges Moshe and Aaron, when Korach challenges their authority, one of the resolutions is that Aaron takes a staff that eventually blossoms, and the Torah tells us, it blossoms with almond flowers. So from there we see it must be that Aaron's staff was an almond staff, was a sort of an almond tree. So maybe Moshe's was as well. So that's where the rabbis get in, and the idea is that the almond tree is somehow significantly tied to Jewish redemption. And that's also expressed in Yirmiyahu, in the prophet Jeremiah. Because in the first chapter of Jeremiah, the very first prophecy he receives, what Jeremiah says, he sees the stick of an almond tree. He sees a rod of an almond tree. And again, just like the rod or the stick that Moses had, that Aaron had from the almond tree, Jeremiah, in a period of precarious time for the Jewish people, thinking about exile and redemption, sees a positive vision of redemption tied to the staff of an almond tree. So again and again, this idea of the almond tree, of this staff, apparently people are being prompted to enter a password code when they try to enter the class. Let me just give a little bit of advice there. Sorry, I'm not sure, okay. Maybe hopefully Jill will take care of that. Or Margie, do you mind reaching out to Jill or someone to... Sorry about that. Okay, sorry everybody. Apparently there's some kind of password problem with entering the class. Okay, thank you.
I'll contact you.
Margie, what'd you say?
I'll contact you.
Okay, good, thank you. All right, guys. But good thing we haven't started the cooking class yet. If people have to show up a little bit later, they'll show up a little bit later. But, exactly. But for now, sorry about people who are stuck waiting to enter the session. Let me claim the hostship also, just so if people need to be let in, I can do that. It's always my worst nightmare that there's something stopping people from entering the class and I don't know about it. So thankfully someone texted me, so this time I found out. All right, hey everybody, thanks for joining. So what we were just saying is that I was just playing before, I'll play it one more time quickly just because I really like it, it's super dope. Let me play. Here it is. Torah. While everybody's waiting. I was just playing a rocked up version of the song Hashkedia Parachat. And I was talking about the role of the shkedia, of the almond tree in Israeli culture, but more specifically, really, in halachic and Torah culture, in the Torah itself. Because while the almond tree in Israel represents the beginning of the spring season, the beginning of the flourishing of the new fruits, in the Torah, it's deeply tied, we were discussing, to redemption. That Moses' staff is said to be that of an almond tree in Chazal, that Aaron's staff blossoms with almond fruits, with almond flowers when he's challenged by Korach. And then later on, the first chapter of Yirmiyahu, the first chapter of Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu's first vision is of a rod of an almond tree. And again, we see that this almond tree, this vision of the almond tree, is tied intimately to redemption, to prophecies of redemption. And one of the themes that Rav Meidan, when I was in the Gush, would mention, and I've heard a few other rabbis mention, is that we mentioned culturally, the almond tree is tied to Tu B'Shvat, is tied to celebration of the spring, celebration of the produce, because the almond tree is one of the first trees to flourish, and one of the first trees to bear fruit and stop flourishing. In the course of 3 weeks, immediately it'll flourish at the beginning of the spring, and by the end of 3 weeks, it'll be done. And what Ramadan and others point out is if that is a characteristic quality of almond trees, that almond trees quickly flourish, and then it's briefly over, then that's what God is trying to reassure the Jewish people about redemption. That it may seem like you're in a period of unending exile, or you may seem in a period of darkness, of isolation, of difficulty, but things can change very quickly. Redemption can happen in the span of a second, in 3 weeks, just like an almond tree. And in fact, even in modern Hebrew, the word shaked, not as a noun, not referring to the almond tree, actually refers to something that's very intense, something that's very persistent, because of this quality, because of this nature of almond trees. That the way they flourish, the way they blossom is so quickly. So Ramadan points out, and we see that it's not just culturally, it's not just in the general Israeli agricultural society that the almond tree is tied to Tu B'Shvat, that the almond tree is tied to the Jewish season and celebration of produce, of the land of Israel's produce. But it's also in the Torah that it's tied to the redemption that is represented by the quick blossoming of the almond tree. So given all that, just one last note, something I always have to mention because I think my brother taught me this when I was little and it just blew my mind. The song goes, I might have mentioned this last year too, Hashkedia porachat, Hashemish paz zorachat. And it's this grammatical invention that the author of the song made up a word, Hashkedia. Didn't exist. The classic Hebrew way to refer to an almond tree is eitz hashaked, an almond tree. But they made up the word shkedia so that they could rhyme the first line with the second line. Hashkedia porachat, hashemish paz zorachat. The only thing is in Hebrew, the word shemesh is actually a bigendered word. It can be either male or female. So they could just say eitz hashaked poreach, hashemish paz zoreach. It would have been exactly grammatically correct without the need to make up a new word like shkedia. But whatever. So they made up a new word, shkedia. We have a beautiful song for Tu B'Shvat that we were all listening to before. But all that is to say that was my inspiration, that while I know I promised on the flyer, I don't know if you guys saw the flyer, that we'd be making a healthy dish for Tu B'Shvat. At first I was thinking, we'll make some salads. It'll be great. And then I thought about it. And you guys don't need me to make a salad. You can make your own salads. You can make better salads than I can. But if I don't get it on video, no one's ever going to think to make an almond horn. So what we're going to make today to celebrate the shkedia and the eitz hashaked, we're going to make almond horns together. So I'm very excited about it. I always love a good gluten-free dessert because a couple of my good friends are gluten-free. So this is going to be a gluten-free parve dessert. That's always exciting. And it's actually pretty easy. Uses a bunch of cool techniques. Yeah, Jill, I see that.
All right, who needs help getting on the call? Because the link should work, so I'll call them if they need help.
Alexander Longarov.
Alexander Longarov?
I think he got on.
Oh, he's in.
It's good.
Hey, Alexander, okay, we're all good. Thank you, Jill. Thank you for
Thanks for offering. I was just about to text on the Facebook.
Thanks. Amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
That was a very quick tech test help.
Yeah, you guys are the best. Amazing. And now everybody got in just in time that we're going to start. So what we're going to start is we're going to make almond horns. And I sent out on Friday or sometime last week, I sent out an email with the recipe we're going to be basing ourselves off of. I did that so if people want to, they can find the ingredients. But we're going to actually tweak the recipe a little bit, and we'll get to there when we get there first. But to begin, we're going to begin with our almond horns. Just as a reminder, I'm going to unmute everybody, and then if anyone has a question or a comment, feel free to unmute yourself. So everybody's muted for now. So to begin with the almond horns, of course, the most important thing is almond flour. So the truth is actually, what we're gonna do today is we're gonna get 2 desserts in one. We're gonna 2 for 1. Because the basis of an almond horn is actually marzipan. So first we're gonna make marzipan, and then we're gonna use the marzipan and turn it into an almond horn. Very easy process. But before we do any of that, what's always the first most important step, we're gonna turn the oven on. We're gonna preheat our oven. So I'm gonna preheat the oven to 350 degrees. Sorry if I'm out of camera, but I can only cover so much of my tiny little kitchen here. So I'm gonna preheat the oven to 350. If you are looking at the recipe I sent along, or if you look at some other recipes, you might notice that they actually preheat and cook it, bake at 325. I found 350 works a little bit better. I like the cookies a little bit puffier, a little less spread out. The hotter the oven is, the puffier they're gonna be, the less chance the sugar will have to melt and spread out before they're browned and done. So I'm gonna do it at 350, I'm gonna heat it up a little bit. And we're gonna start by making marzipan. So marzipan is really just an almond paste, like a thick almond paste. I actually remember that when I was younger, I don't remember when, I was in a candy store with my mom, and I saw these beautiful little colorful fruits. I was like, oh, those look awesome. My mom's like, you're not gonna like them. And of course I didn't believe her, and I insisted on getting them. And then when I bit into them, I was extremely upset when it tasted like marzipan. Thankfully nowadays I'm an adult, I really like marzipan, so it's not an issue. But marzipan always looks very pretty. So we're gonna mix the marzipan, it won't look as pretty, but it'll be useful. So the key to marzipan really is just the 1-to-1 ratio of almond flour and powdered sugar. So I'm gonna add to my stand mixer, gotta have the stand mixer, 170 grams of almond flour. And of course we always use grams, both because it saves me from having to find measuring cups in my tiny little kitchen, but more importantly, because it makes the recipes more precise to use weight instead of volume. So 170 grams of almond flour to 170 grams of just regular powdered sugar, confectioner's sugar. So a 1-to-1 ratio of confectioner's sugar to almond powder. I'll get that guy in there. Sorry about that. Perfect. Okay. And then to bind it, to hold it together, we're going to be using our liquid binding agent for the whole day, which is egg whites. Just separate an egg. I would have done it on camera, but what if I messed it up and it takes so long? But just a good trick to know, the easiest way to separate an egg yolk from an egg white is, in my experience, at least just your fingers. Just scoop in, pull it out. It's a little gross. So 1 pre-separated egg white, gonna add that guy in. 1/8 of a teaspoon, or really I'm just gonna do a pinch of salt. And yeah, this little blue container is my salt container. I only use it when I'm baking for salt. There's no good reason, but this is where the salt goes. It goes in the little blue dish. So we're gonna do 1/8 of a teaspoon or a pinch of salt. And then of course, one of the most important ingredients, almond extract. So usually in my experience, when it comes to using extracts or artificial flavors, I guess this isn't so artificial, it's extracted from almonds, but less is more. But in this case, I'm gonna be using a lot of it. So the recipe calls for a teaspoon. I just sort of pour until it looks good because I really love almond extract. Fun fact, almond extract though isn't actually extracted from almonds. Apparently almonds and cherries are from the same flower family, and it's extracted from cherry pits. And cherry pits have the same oils, or the oil extracted from cherry pits has the same flavor as almonds. So I thought that was pretty cool when I learned that. Actually, sometimes when I make cherry baked goods, instead of trying to find or hunt down a cherry extract or a cherry flavor, I'll just use a little bit of almond extract, and with the right recipe, it should taste a little bit cherrier, stronger cherry flavor. So we added our 1-to-1 powdered sugar and our almond flour. We added 1 egg white. Though really, we can add as many or as little egg white as we want the consistency of the marzipan to be. If we want a sticky marzipan, a drier marzipan, egg whites are our binding agent. And we added a pinch of salt. So that alone is enough to make our marzipan, our DIY make-it-yourself marzipan. So we're just gonna add the paddle to the stand mixer. You may or may not see, I don't know if you can notice, but I have the crank stand mixer. It was a big research, a big moment in our life when we had to decide what stand mixer to pick. But apparently the crank one lasts longer because there's less moving pieces than the flip up one. So that's an important thing to think about. And so we crank up our stand mixer. I'm just gonna mix the marzipan on the low speed for a little bit. It's always important with the stand mixer, you start at a low speed and then slowly speed it up. Otherwise, you're gonna do what I always do and get covered in dust and flour as it just gets kicked up everywhere. But I'm used to that by now. So we'll do a little bit more. See up just a little bit more. And perfect. So now we'll just take a quick look at what we have so far. This This right here is extremely easy to make. Do it yourself. Marzipan. Oh, it's dripping a little bit. So we have marzipan. So if you wanted to just eat this, or if you wanted to add some food coloring and shape it and decorate with it, we're good to go. So that's our first dish. We got our almond marzipan done, and I only got a little powdered sugar all over everywhere. Excellent. So now, to turn this almond paste, to turn this marzipan into a cookie, we're going to add more of the same, basically. We're going to add sugar, almond flour, and more egg yolks with a little bit more salt and a little bit more almond paste. And really the goal of what we're trying to do here is we're adding more plain sugar, not powdered sugar. We're adding a lot more eggs and we're adding more flour to try and make something that's a little bit more easier to bind, but more than that, easier to puff up, easier to spread out in the oven. Because really the cookie isn't just going to bake and get hard, but it's because of all the eggs, because of all the air that's going to be beaten into it, though hopefully not too much, it's actually going to puff up a little bit. It's going to spread out a little bit in the oven too. So to do that, we're going to add some regular old sugar, because as we know, regular sugar melts when it gets hot. We're going to add some more almond flour, and we're going to add some more egg whites. So now an interesting note, something to note, in the recipe, it says to add 200 grams of sugar to 50 grams of almond flour. That's the King Arthur recipe that I was basing this off of, my first batch before I perfected a little. And in my experience, that was really bad for two reasons. Reason one is it was crazy sweet. Shoshana actually prefers it. She has more of a sweet tooth than I do. She was upset when I was working on the recipe and reduced the sugar. But 200 grams of sugar to 50 grams of almond flour, crazy sweet. But more than that, as we're talking about the shape of the cookie in the oven, we have to remember that sugar, as we said, is what causes the cookie to spread out. Sugar melts when it gets hot. So we do want the cookie to spread a little bit. We do want the cookie to melt and puff up and spread. But if we use 4 times as much sugar as almond flour, if we use 200 grams of sugar to 50 grams of almond flour, it's just going to be like a pancake. It's just going to spread out. Actually, I'll show you because I have some of my first samples from when I did the 200 grams of sugar. You get a pancake. You get a very flat cookie. They taste great. There's nothing wrong with them. But I prefer the shape to be a little puffier. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the 50 grams of almond flour prescribed in the King Arthur recipe. And we're just going to add 50 grams of sugar. 50 grams of sugar. For those at home, if you want to play around a little bit, you should know you can add more sugar, either 100 grams or 200 grams. And the real thing that the real difference would just be you would have to refrigerate the dough for much longer before baking it. Because the more sugar, the more the cookie will spread out. So if you add, let's say 200 grams or even 100 grams of sugar, make it a little bit more sweet, a little sweeter. It will mess a little bit with the consistency, but not so significantly. The bigger difference will just be refrigerate it for 2 to 24 hours before you bake it. Really, even this we should refrigerate. Okay, so let me just finish before I keep talking. I'm going to add 2 more egg whites. So we just added to our marzipan another 50 grams of almond flour, another 50 grams of just plain sugar, 2 more egg whites. Now some more salt. Now this time a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. We got another salt dish there. And finally, another teaspoon or another splash of almond extract. There you go. So now one more time, I'm going to go pull this up and mix it, starting slow and getting faster. So as I was saying, ideally, even this, we would really refrigerate first, because almost any time you make cookies, you can really benefit from refrigerating them. Cookies are basically butter, sugar, and eggs, and sugar and butter, sugar and fat melt at hot temperatures. So if you're going to cook if you're going to bake your cookies properly, if they're going to be browned properly, then they're going to start melting if they're not refrigerated. So you can either play with the ratios of fat and sugar, which is what we're doing a little bit here for our class, or you can refrigerate. But what we have now is our slightly less sweet, slightly less fragile, needs a little bit less refrigeration time, almond horn base. So let me just get this guy out. We'll see that what we have here is a nice paste, an almond paste. So of course the texture of the paste, the moisture of it, is going to be determined by how much sugar you use, how much egg white you use, how much almond flour you use. So you see, and also how much vanilla extract, how much almond extract you use. So we see we use 3 egg whites in total, 220 grams of almond flour, 170 grams of powdered sugar, 50 grams of sugar, normal sugar, and a bunch of almond extract. And we get this pretty pasty, pretty moist, pretty wet type of a paste. So the next step is going to be shaping. So one option is to refrigerate this a little bit, let it get a little bit more solid, and like a cookie, try and scoop it out and shape it with your hands. And that is a good option. But I don't know if I have enough content to keep you guys busy while we wait for things to cool and while we wait for things to bake. That's a lot of content. So instead what we're gonna do is we're gonna pipe the cookies. So in order to pipe the cookies, you're gonna need a piping bag. Again, you don't need this. You can either refrigerate and do it by hand, or you can make your own piping bag using just a simple Ziploc bag and snipping off the corner. But I'm gonna use a piping bag just because I have it, might as well use it. And then just to make it easier to fill the piping bag, I like to take a big jar or a big cup or a big glass and just fit that in right there over the mouth. Put that down here. And we'll see, just take the paste and just feed it straight into the bag. Just like that. There you go. So we're gonna take our almond paste, feed it into our piping bag. I always have to get a bunch on me while I do this, of course. All right, you guys can see, just making sure the camera's in it. Perfect. So I will say that every time I've done this recipe, I've had a different consistency slightly to how it's piped. That's not really a problem because, and one, it'll depend on the size of your eggs. It'll depend on the moisture in that day. There's all kinds of things that can affect how it'll turn out. But really, you can control how long you need to bake it and at what conditions by controlling how much sugar you put in. But more than that, by controlling the temperature of the oven, by controlling how long you refrigerate or chill the dough for, et cetera, et cetera. So if you have a very dry dough, you could probably bake it at 325 at a slightly lower temperature for 15 minutes. You would probably still have a rather moist cookie. But we have a pretty moist cookie here, though low in sugar. So we're going to bake ours at 350, as we said before. We just finished cleaning out our paste, putting it into our piping bag, and now we're done with this jar. So you can just put that jar away. What we see now is we have a piping bag full of almond paste. So I'm trying to get this paste down a little bit more so it doesn't come out at the top all over me. Already has a little. Perfect. Great. Now we're going to take a scissor, normal scissor, hopefully clean. I washed it before. And we're going to snip a tip at the end of the bag. Here, most piping bags come with preset options based off of the width of the diameter. So it's usually 1, 2, or 3, either centimeters or whatever it might be. I'm just going to go with the middle option here. Just make a slightly bigger hole to pipe out of. I like my almond horns a little bit bigger. And then once I have this hole right here, I have a piping bag all set. One really important thing that I mess up all the time in piping is you really have to hold it from the top. Because if you hold it anywhere but from the top, even if you rubber band it shut, you're just going to start squeezing stuff out the top and it's going to end up all over your hand, the arm, your floor, everywhere. So make sure you hold the piping bag from the top and it's just a downward squeezing motion, a downward motion. So we have our piping bag. And in addition to the piping bag, we have a cookie sheet. And I'm going to use a silicone mat on the cookie sheet. So you could just use parchment paper. And parchment paper is great. We have some here. I use it all the time. If you don't have a silicone mat, don't feel bad. But one of the advantages of a silicone mat is that silicone mats, because they're made of silicone, are very grippy and very sticky. So when you're making a cookie that you want to puff, but you want it to puff up instead of puff out in the oven, one way to help it along a little bit is to use a bit of a grippier, stickier surface. So you can just use parchment paper and it'll be fine, it'll be great. But I'm gonna cheat a little bit and I'm gonna use this grippy, sticky silicone mat. I don't know if you can see, but the silicone mat already has little shapes on it because it was made really for macarons originally. But that's because macarons, if you think about it, are a very similar recipe, a very similar cookie. They're also a cookie you want to puff up and not out. But more than that, they're also a cookie made out of sugar, almond flour, and eggs. So if you think about it in a way, an almond horn is sort of just like a differently shaped macaron. And instead of beating the eggs beating air into them, you just incorporate them. But other than that, it's basically the same thing. But fine, so we have our sticky, grippy little mat. We have our bag full of almond paste to pipe. And now let's see if I can get a good angle where you guys can see. So this back here. Now we're just gonna pipe some horn shapes. So let's hope I don't embarrass myself doing this. There you go, that's one horn. You got to leave some space between them because they're going to puff out, as we said in the oven. 2 horns, 3 horns. Again, making sure I'm on top of the bag, staying on top. If you mess up the shape a little, that's not a huge deal. You can change the shape, especially if you chill them. But even if you don't chill them, if they're still a little bit warm and wet, if you just wet your hands slightly, then usually you can handle things like a wet dough, a sticky, tacky dough, without it sticking to you, without ruining the shape. See, so just keep piping. Should be able to get close to 2 dozen small ones or 1 dozen slightly larger ones. I prefer them smaller, but here. Sorry, all right, we're almost done with this sheet. There, there, and there. Okay, and now in a second, I'll hold it up to the camera so everyone can see the fruit of our work, our labor here. We just touch up the end. Fruit of our labor, good pun, good point, Shoshana. That's a good pun for Tu B'Shvat. All right. Okay, so these aren't perfect, but not bad. We have our horns. Great. So now that we have our little horn shapes, I'm just going to quickly rinse my hands. And I don't know if you can see the horns a little bit, but as my hands are still a little bit wet, a little bit dripping, it's very easy now to shape them a little bit better without the dough sticking to me. So if I want to touch it up a little, I just get my hands a little bit wet, and then I can shape it. Now, another advantage of the dough being a little bit wetter is that when you use the silicone mat, it's going to get stuck to it, which sounds like a bad thing, but again, for our goal of having it spread up instead of spread out, it's actually a good thing. Okay, good. So now we have our slightly touched up 12 horns right here. And for our finishing touch, our final touch, we're going to take 1 more egg white, and we're going to beat it up, just to beat an egg white. And we're going to glaze the horns and add some slivered almonds on top. So I'll take this egg white here. I'm just going to brush it on all the horns. Not going to be afraid to get the egg white a little bit into the horn, push down a little bit, get it stuck on the mat so that there's some more traction so that it puffs up instead of out. I'm going to go get these horns wet, nice and wet. Okay. These horns are a little wet. I'm afraid they'll spread a little bit, but we'll see what we can do. Always a risk. But that's why you're on Rabbi Leon's cooking show and not on Food Network, because it might not turn out perfect. That's part of the fun. All right. Now you're here for the Torah. LOL. All right. There will be more Torah. Don't worry. Okay. So now we see that we have glazed all of our almond horns. Now I'm just going to take some slivered almonds. Just bought them at the store. I'm just going to coat them all in slivered almonds. If I was making this for like a Shabbos dinner or like a dessert or something, or if I was bringing it to Kiddush at the shul, I'd spend 40 minutes individually selecting the proper slices to put on each little almond. But that's absolutely insane, as Shoshana reminds me all the time. So for our class together, I'm just going to haphazardly sprinkle some almond slivers on top. But feel free to be as crazy about this as I tend to be when you make it on your own. So I'm just going to sliver some more almonds there, some almonds. And honestly, from my experience, getting a well-coated almond horn, like getting the egg white, the egg wash, and the almonds all over it, really also encourages the proper shape in baking. It sort of adds a little bit of pressure, adds a little bit of weight to it, and it stops it from spreading too much. So I'm just gonna be a little bit more generous with the almonds. There you go, and we're almost done. Okay, and there we go. So what we see now is our almond horns. Pretty cool. So I'm going to now place these almond horns in the oven for 15 minutes at 350 degrees. They're going to spread a bit. That's going to hurt me. But hopefully at the end, one of the tricks we'll see with almond horns is they're a very forgiving cookie. Because even if you mess up the almond horn, you can actually reshape it pretty easily as soon as you pull it out of the oven. So we're going to put these in, hope for the best, hope for the right shape to come out. It's not quite as risky as when I make macarons. There I would say I'm not nearly as successful, but we'll hope for our best. Alexa, set 15-minute timer. So Alexa will be keeping track of time for us.
Starting now.
Awesome. All right, so in the meantime, should we melt the chocolate? No, first we'll give it Dvar Torah. So while we wait for the cookies to bake, we'll do a Dvar Torah. I don't know, for some people, this might be the reason you came. For other people, this might be the time to space out. But we opened with a bit of a Dvar Torah about why we picked almond horns, about the importance of almonds in the Torah. But David, where is your sous chef? Oh, Shoshana's in the other room in the peanut gallery giving commentary off screen. This time around, she's not sous chefing, but it's a good question. Oh, I'm sorry if other people's Alexa's also set to timer. Didn't mean to do that. All right. So she'll come say hi at the end. I'm sure she'll come to eat a cookie or two. So our second Dvar Torah, or our real Dvar Torah today, or what I really wanted to share is something I've been thinking about a lot, looking into a lot, about what really is the purpose of Tu B'Shvat. Because Tu B'Shvat's a very weird holiday. And it's not just that it's a weird holiday, it's a holiday that historically has had a lot of really different meanings. Because in the times of the temple, and the times where Jews lived in Israel in the temple period, Tu B'Shvat was an important day to know what fruit you have to give as tithes to the Kohen and Levi. Certain tithes were dependent on the year. You had needed a way to keep track of what year was it. So for tithing, for produce, the year was set, the calendar was set by Tu B'Shvat. In other words, Tu B'Shvat was like a very practical calendar date that was needed to keep track of, oh, do I give the Kohen my fruit? Do I give the Levi my fruit this year? Do I give the poor person my fruit this year, etc. But then, of course, after the destruction of the temple, we didn't have that anymore. We didn't have tithes. We didn't have living in Israel, giving the Kohen and Levi fruit. And Tu B'Shvat actually took on a totally different meaning that I didn't even know about. Apparently, during the times of the Rishonim, during the times of the early medieval into the early modern period, Tu B'Shvat was largely about the brachot people say on fruit and vegetables. Because Jews in diaspora had no actual connection to the physical land of Israel. So they used Tu B'Shvat as a time to learn about brachot. What bracha do you make on an apple? What do you make on a carrot? What do you make on a lychee? Whatever. Maybe it got a little harder. Just by the way, as a side note, 3 weeks ago, I think, This American Life did an episode on bracha bees. I definitely recommend it if you want some Jewish visibility in media. But anyways, it would be very, very appropriate for Tu B'Shvat, because apparently back in the day, Tu B'Shvat was a period to learn brachot. And then eventually, 15th, 16th century, the Hasidim come along, and the Hasidim infuse all kinds of Kabbalah into the changing of seasons and the growth and the metaphor of shells and losing shells, whatever that stuff means. And then unsurprisingly, comes 1948, Tu B'Shvat becomes all about Zionism, about the land of Israel, about living in the land of Israel. And nowadays, I think Tu B'Shvat is infused with a meaning of ecological concern, environmental concern, care for the planet, almost like Earth Day. We have this like amorphous holiday, and it's constantly changing meaning. And that really bothers me in terms of figuring out what is the meaning I'm supposed to find in it. Is this supposed to be the day where I look over brachot, or is it supposed to be a day where I'm trying to save the planet? Is it a day I should learn about Truma and Maaser? What is the point of the day? And I think something that often happens is that oftentimes we'll have these days that are a little bit amorphous. There's a million reasons. There's a million things we do on them. Another example that comes to mind is Sfira, the period between Pesach and Shavuos. There's a million things we're mourning and a million different practices. And often, I think it could be the case that this ambiguity or this huge plurality of explanations flourishes because of a vacuum created by forgetting the original temple intent of the day. So we talked around Sfira time about what was the original temple celebration of Sfira Omer. But something I want to focus on a little bit today is the temple or the original conception of Tu B'Shvat. And to do that, I want to start with the very first Mishnah that talks about Tu B'Shvat. And we know the very first Mishnah on Rosh Hashanah goes over all of the New Years, all the Jewish New Years. So the easiest Jewish New Year, of course, is Rosh Hashanah. The first day of Tishrei, Aleph Tishrei, is Rosh Hashanah, the new year for humans. And then there's also a new year for kings, there's a new year for animals, for tithes, and there's Tu B'Shvat, the new year for produce. But what's interesting is in that Mishnah, there's actually a machloket. There's a debate about what is the proper date, what day is the new year for produce. Is it Tu B'Shvat, like we all celebrate? That's the position of Beis Hillel. Or Beis Shammai says it's actually the first day of Shvat. And that's a really weird machloket, right? Like, what's that debate about? How are they having a debate about what's the new year for produce? Isn't that just like a day on the calendar? But I want to suggest that what the debate about is actually really fundamental. Because you see, when Beis Shammai says that Tu B'Shvat should be the first day of the month, Beis Shammai is saying that at its core, the main value, the main idea behind Tu B'Shvat is that it's like a calendar day. It's New Year's. It's a way to keep track of what is the proper produce day. And of course, every New Year's, every calendar day, every legal new start of a quarter, start of a period, starts on the first of the month. That's just good bureaucracy. It's easy to keep track of. So Shvat is going to be when we keep track of the new year for produce, just like the new year for the kings, the new year's for animals, new year's for everything, should be on the first day of the month. But I think what Beis Hillel is communicating by saying, no, it's actually on the 15th day of the month, is that Tu B'Shvat is actually meant to be more than just a calendar date. And that's why, unlike some of the other calendar dates, the New Year's for kings or for animals, we actually celebrate Tu B'Shvat. Because Tu B'Shvat is supposed to be a holiday. And I think that's why the Beis Hillel contends it has to be on the 15th of the month. Because what takes place on the 15th of the month? Religious holidays. Pesach is the 15th of Nisan. Sukkot is the 15th of Tishrei. We know the only reason Shavuos is, and it's because Shavuos is tied 7 weeks after Pesach. But ideally, in the biblical sense, in the Torah's idea, when are holidays? The 15th of the month. Tetvav, all the holidays are tied together about being on the 15th of the month. So the debate is Tisha B'Av a calendar date, a ledger date to keep track of the proper day? Or is Tisha B'Av actually a Jewish religious holiday? But if it's a religious holiday, what exactly are we celebrating? So, right, that's the question we're left with. So to answer that, I want to suggest something that, I don't know, I saw this for the first time this year, maybe other people have heard this, but it just opened my eyes to something I never thought about before in Tisha B'Av. And that's as follows. There's, in Tu B'Shvat, not Tisha B'Av, sorry, in Tu B'Shvat. There's actually, you'll see why I made that mistake in a second. There's actually another day, in addition to Tu B'Shvat, in addition to Pesach, in addition to Sukkot, there's another day, another Jewish holiday that takes place on the 15th of the month. Does anybody know what the holiday is? Yeah, David said it, but he's on mute. Tu B'Av, exactly. Tu B'Av also takes place on the 15th of the month. Right after Tisha B'Av, the week after, the 15th of the month of Av is a holiday. And the Gemara brings all kinds of reasons as to why it's a holiday. But one of the reasons that consistently appears throughout the Gemara, everywhere in the Gemara, is that Tu B'Av is the last day, the day where they finished cutting down trees for wood for the Mizbeach, to collect wood to burn the sacrifices for the rest of the year. And the Gemara says, why was Tu B'Av the last day? Because starting Tu B'Av, the new season was too hot, it would dry out the wood and it wouldn't be good to use. So in other words, what we see from the Gemara is that Tu B'Av was a holiday, they call it Yom Tov, celebrating that they have completed the work of cutting down or preparing wood to run the temple, to burn the altar, to do temple service. So now, if that was the last day where they finished cutting down the wood, was Tu B'Av, and it was a huge holiday because they celebrated finishing their work, what was the first day? When did they start cutting down wood for the temple? So the Maharsha points out that if the reason why Tu B'Av was the last day they cut it down is because the seasons changed and it got too hot, well, there's about 2 seasons in Halakha, 2 seasons in Israel. So it must have been 6 months they cut wood. 6 months is too hot to cut wood. And of course, what is exactly 6 months before Tu B'Av? Tu B'Shvat. 6 months apart exactly. So says the Maharsha, every year from Tu B'Shvat until Tu B'Av was actually a 6-month period of cutting wood and preparing the temple for the rest of the year's celebration. And it opened with a holiday, Tu B'Shvat, where they would celebrate that they got to have the honor of cutting the wood, of preparing the temple for the rest of the year. And it ended with a holiday, Tu B'Av, where they celebrated their hard work and looked back on the past 6 months and said, look, we prepared the temple. So that was something I never heard before. And it really changed my perspective entirely on Tu B'Shvat. Because what we have here is a connection. Tu B'Shvat is not Rosh Hashanah Leperot, the new year for fruit. It's not Rosh Hashanah Liyarakot, the new year for vegetables. It's Rosh Hashanah Li'ilanot, for trees. And what's fascinating is we see that from Tu B'Shvat to Tu B'Av, we're focusing on trees, but not as fruit-bearing trees necessarily, but as wood-bearing trees. As literal trees, we're focusing on the Ilan as a means to temple service. If we didn't have trees to cut down and turn to logs and burn in the temple, we wouldn't be able to serve God, to worship God. And that is what the 6 months of Tu B'Shvat to Tisha, from Tu B'Av to Tu B'Av, from Tu B'Shvat to Tu B'Av is all about. It's celebrating the 6 months of preparation so that the rest of the year we can run the temple. And once I understood that, I thought that's just a fascinating way of viewing this holiday. Because we can still appreciate a good Jewish Earth Day, And we can still care about all the environmental reasons and the Zionist reasons and all the other stuff people put on Tu B'Shvat. But from a biblical perspective, from a temple perspective, I think what we can see is a really beautiful idea. We don't have Pesach and Shvat. We don't have Sukkot. In fact, what we have is a really long winter dark period of no holidays. But during that dark period of no holidays, during the cold season, what should we be doing? We should be preparing for the rest of the year. And not just preparing, we should be celebrating the preparations. It's a holiday that we get to prepare. It's something that we need to be intentional about, to recognize that we have a Pesach, we have a Sukkot every once in a while, but the rest of the time there's not holidays, there's not special Jewish occasions, it's just daily life. And that's less exciting. But nonetheless, we have this reminder at the beginning and at the end, as we start our preparations, as we start a new project, and as we look back at what we accomplished, that sometimes the behind the scenes work is just as important. Sometimes the behind the scenes work also deserves celebration, also deserves a holiday. So I think Tu B'Shvat really in that sense takes on a beautiful meaning. Tu B'Shvat is the non-holiday holiday. It's not Sukkot, it's not Pesach, but it's an opportunity to reflect, to prepare for Pesach, to prepare for Sukkot, and to appreciate the opportunity. That the hard work that we're able to put in our religious preparation, our spiritual preparation, our career preparation, that it pays off dividends. That because we have the opportunity to prepare, we'll have the opportunity to reap those figurative fruits as we turn towards the literal fruits of Tu B'Shvat. So hopefully that added a bit of a different meaning to Tu B'Shvat, one we hadn't heard before. It's something that I thought was very fascinating. And we can appreciate the 6-month period, this half a year period, kicked off by Tu B'Shvat as a time for preparation, a time to look forward, a time to get ready for what comes ahead. So given that, I'm just going to check quickly our almond horns. And they're actually looking pretty great. Good job, team. All right. So we have 3 minutes left on our timer. In those 3 minutes, we're going to melt some chocolate to finish off our almond horns. Because traditionally, an almond horn is dipped in chocolate at the end. So what I have here is 170 grams of chocolate. You really can just use however much chocolate you want. And I'm going to add to the 170 grams of chocolate just a drizzle of canola oil. Use vegetable oil, any neutral oil. Don't use olive oil. That has a flavor to it. But a neutral oil, some chocolate. And what I'm going to do is melt the chocolate. But melting chocolate, as people may or may not know, is a very tricky thing to do. Because you need to be able to temper chocolate properly. If you melt chocolate improperly, if you get it too hot or don't control the temperature, the crystals suspended in the chocolate, chocolate's a mixture of sugar crystals and fat, the crystals suspended in the chocolate will end up being visible, will end up being not properly set, and you'll get a rough, bumpy, non-smooth chocolate, an ugly, poor textured chocolate. So it's important to properly melt chocolate to not overheat it. One way that people, so I don't know if people know this, but my mom actually was a chocolatier. My mom had a bunch of chocolate stores. And the way my mom eventually tempered chocolate was through these giant machines that held like gallons of chocolate that would spin it till it got to a precise temperature, and then it would just keep it at that temperature indefinitely. We don't have that. The way that she used to temper chocolate back when she started making chocolate, and the way that people used to, was they'd actually spill it out on a marble surface, on a cold surface, and then they'd move the chocolate back and forth with a scraper or like a pastry knife, like one of these guys, and the movement would eventually control the temperature until they got it to the right temperature. We're not going to do that either. If you're making just a dip or a simple melted chocolate, there's 2 at-home tricks that are very easy. One is the double boiler, and that is to set up a pot of boiling water and to either put another pot or a heat-safe glass bowl on top. And that distance, the double boiler, will ensure you don't scorch or burn your chocolate, you don't have untempered chocolate. The other method that I prefer to use is the microwave. And it requires a little bit of chachma, a little bit of wisdom, because if you just throw it in the microwave, you're going to burn and melt your chocolate, and it's going to be very gross. So the trick that I learned that blew my mind, I'm sorry you don't have the camera on the microwave, but everyone's microwave looks different. But the trick that I learned that blew my mind is when you melt chocolate in the microwave, you have to use the power level of the microwave. You have to set it to 50% power. So what I'm going to do with my microwave, I'm just going to turn it. I'm going to hold it so everyone can see. I'm going to set a 90-second microwave timer, and I'm going to set the power level to 50%. So 1, 2, 3, 90 seconds, power level 10. We're going to set it to 5. So now we're going to let it go for 1.5 minutes on half power. Alexa, stop. that is the timer for our almond horns. So let's take out our almond horns. Gonna need a second to find some of it. Sorry about that. I got it. Thank you. Shoshana felt bad, David. Now she wants to be in the camera. All right. So far, not bad. We're going to let them get a little more brown, leave them in for a couple of minutes, but so far looking pretty good, Alexa, set 2-minute timer. This is a personal preference. If you wanted to eat them after 15 minutes like that, they're ready to go. I personally like them a little browner, so I'm going to put them back in for today. Yeah, that's true. Alexa is always the best sous chef, but Alexa's also just the best personal assistant in general, so she has a lot of jobs. But so we have our chocolate. After a minute, I'm just going to take it out because I was getting nervous, but you can let it go for a minute and a half on half power. But the most important thing in tempering chocolate in the microwave is just that you constantly stop, stir it, and then put it back in. So stop, stir it after a minute, putting it back in for another 30 seconds at half power. After 30 seconds, I'm going to take it out again, stir it, put it in for another 30 seconds at half power. After 2 or 3 times, it should eventually melt. So while we wait for that, just to share a little personal history, that actually almond horns are a very personally, I don't know, important, but personally connected cookie. Back in the day, from kindergarten to 6th grade, we lived in West Hartford, Connecticut. And it was a very small, quaint Jewish community without a kosher restaurant, without a lot of Jewish infrastructure, but they had the best kosher bakery with just giant cookies and whole almond horns and everything. And I have strong memories of almond horns from that. But really, almond horns have really followed me and Shoshana a lot in life because I don't know if how many people know this, but we got engaged in Paris a few years ago when we got engaged. I surprised Shoshana with a trip to Paris. And I remember sitting in the Beit Midrash in NYU, and I told my chavruta, my friend Isaac, I just bought tickets to Paris, I'm going to propose. He said, that's awesome. You can get me almond horns from the kosher bakery there. And that was his first reaction. And then eventually he said, Mazel Tov, I'm so excited. But it is true that the almond horns in Paris were really amazing. We're just mixing a little bit more. And that definitely was one of our takeaways in addition to our engagement. And then now after that, every time we travel in Europe, one of the things that we look for in kosher bakeries is always the almond horns. So we were just in Italy about 6 weeks ago, and they actually didn't have almond horns. Instead, what they had, which was another 30 seconds at half power, instead what they had, which was really fascinating, was these almost like bars, like closed bars with almond filling and pistachio on top, which were awesome. Alexa, stop. But now it's a little bit of thing that I always look for throughout our travels whenever we go to Europe. We always have to compare how are the French almond horns, the Italian almond horns. There you go. So now we have our almond horns. Looking pretty good. We'll put these guys just over here to cool for a little bit. Oh, no, not straight on the cutting board. That's where we'll put them in it. Okay, good. Perfect. We'll take our chocolate out. And as we can see, the chocolate's starting to turn melty, starting to turn nice and liquidy. I think another 30 seconds after this and it should be done. So ideally, if we weren't doing a cooking class, we would take our cookies, put them by the windowsill, give them a couple hours to cool down, and eventually they'd firm up, they'd cool down, etc. But we don't really have that kind of time. So I'm gonna go put them in the freezer for about 30 seconds while we wait for our chocolate to melt. Again, power level 5, the most important part. I'm gonna put our cookies in the freezer for a little bit to cool down. And hopefully by the time our chocolate's ready, our cookies will be firm enough to handle. So I'll be back in a second.
Hi, everyone. Good to see everyone.
How are you doing?
Happy Tu B'Shvat.
Yeah.
Liad is finding a spot to cool the almond horns.
Oh, good. How about outside?
That's exactly what he's doing.
Oh,
He's putting them outside.
yes. My seltzer froze out there pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's useful.
Shoshana wanted to show off the cookies she made for
I
Shabbos.
want to show what they're going to look like in the
We'll
end.
get there. We'll
I
get
know, I
there.
didn't have to spoil it.
Yeah, no spoilers. Hopefully, we'll
Don't
get
you
there.
worry that some animals are gonna come and eat them?
That's a good point. Some animals might float up in the air and eat them like in Bugs Bunny cartoons.
I will walk.
That is.
I mean,
Shoshana
like
doesn't
pigeons,
want to.
squirrels.
Actually, thankfully, our common room window looks out into a little maintenance room. So the downside is we never get any natural sunlight. The upside is we don't have to worry about things coming into our window. But right now we have our melted chocolate. And we see how pretty and shiny it is as opposed to untempered and clumpy and not so shiny. So we have our melted chocolate. I'm gonna put this down here. We'll see if our 30 seconds in the windowsill made a difference with our almond horns. If not, we have backups that I pre-made that we can dip.
Oh, it's so clever.
Yeah, I do what I can. I try sometimes.
That's why we call you Chef Rabbi.
Oh, exactly. Oh, Shoshana, David, you pressured her. She felt so bad about not sous chefing.
Not
She
ready.
insists on carrying them. Not
Not
ready?
ready.
What do you mean? They're too soft?
They're too soft.
They're too soft? Okay, fine. So we'll just take one of the pre-made cookies. So we'll take the pre-made cookies. Hopefully by the time we've done a few of the pre-made ones, we'll be able to handle the other ones. We'll just take a pre-made cookie, and I mean, no one really needs me to demonstrate this because it's extremely easy, but first, most importantly, gotta brave the disgusting, not disgusting, but crowded kitchen appliances to get out a rack. Need a cooling rack. Right here. Perfect. Everyone can see. And then we're just going to dip a cookie. It's pretty easy. So where's that cookie I just took out? So I guess we'll use one of these. Okay. So we'll just take, this is one of these guys. Pre-made cookie. Not as pretty as our cookies, but not bad. And you just take it, dip it in. And then the important thing is you're gonna have this drizzle that you're gonna want to turn the cookie so that it ends up on top. Just like that. I'll do one more just so everyone can see, and then you put it down on the drying rack. So one more, take the cookie, dip it in, pull it up, and now you see the drizzle, drizzle, drizzle. Just turn your cookie so that the drizzle ends up on top. Just like that. Shauna, how are the hot cookies looking?
I'm gonna check.
All right, we're gonna try our fresh cookies. See, here, maybe with a spatula, we can lift one up. What do you think about that idea?
Not ready.
Not ready?
Not ready.
All right.
Sorry.
So we won't dip our fresh cookies. We'll have to do 2 separate steps. But ultimately, our final product should look something like this when it dries. And this is the
That's a
cookies
good
that
one.
we're left with. You see that it puffed up nicely. It has the little cookie, the little almond slivers, and when the chocolate dries in about 15 to 30 minutes, you'll have a nice shiny but handleable without melting chocolate here. Perfect. And hopefully I want you guys to show me yours when you make them. So please feel free to show me your cookies if and when you make them. And hopefully we learned a little bit about almond cookies, a little bit about Tu B'Shvat. So thanks everyone for joining. Really appreciate it. If anyone's able to, in half an hour in the show, we're going to be having a Yurtzeit Ben Chamarev for the first Yurtzeit of Corinne Shmuel's mother, Ricky Shmuel. So anyone who can make it to the show in person, please do. I'm happy to give out some almond horns if you come. Corinne is bringing, I think, some of her mom's favorite snacks to give out. So that would mean a lot. And stay
One of our
tuned.
Shabbos guests one of our Shabbos guests broke off the legs on all of our almond horns.
Yeah, it's a little rude.
So we have half almond horns that we can give out.
It's
That's
a
true.
question mark. You can ask a question.
There you go. There you go.
And just as a reminder, in addition to the Yurtzeit davening we're going to be doing tonight, Saturday night and Sunday morning, we're going to do another for David Deutsch's father. So that's important. And if anyone else has Yurtzeits coming up, please feel free to reach out. We'd love to try and coordinate a minyan so you can say Kaddish. And then one last note, this Wednesday, we're launching Beginner's Talmud. So it's going to be open to everybody. It's going to be learning how to read Talmud, discussion about what you think about Talmud, everything and all good things. So please join us this Wednesday at 7 as we start Beginner's Talmud. So thank you everybody for coming. I'll post a picture of the cool down cookies when they cool down on Facebook, so look out for that. And hopefully I see a bunch of people in half an hour at the show, and if not, I'll see everybody around Tuesday for classes, Wednesday for classes, etc. So have a great night, everybody.
Bye,
Have a good weekend.
everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Hey,
Happy
where's
Tuesday.
Pepper? Where's
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
that's a
where's
good
Pepper?
point. We can't have a class without having Pepper.
Seriously, come on.
Yeah. She's wearing Margie's sweater. Margie knitted the sweater for her.
Oh my
It's gotta
God.
be-
Oh.
Look how stylish she is in her little sweater.
She's very excited to celebrate Tu B'Shvat, even though she does not.
Oh, the sweater looks great on her.
Oh, you did a great job, Margie.
That's beautiful.
All right, thank
Bye,
you, everybody. Happy
everyone.
Tu
Bye,
B'Shvat.
everybody.